Recording in progress.
We can have bonfires and and I had some give it some of the photos and things like that. Plus, I just see a lot of these
Cool, ready to go?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm Melanie, the Adult Services Librarian here, for those of you who don't know me. And I am impromptuly introducing the wonderful Mark Pace, who is going to present this awesome presentation. We are recording the presentation. It should mostly just be him talking. But cool. Thank you again for coming, and enjoy.
Okay. In doing research for tonight's program, I kind of came up on a theme I hadn't thought about before. In the history of the Civil Rights Movement, and more specifically the history of African Americans, transportation keeps showing up. Plessy versus Ferguson, that established the right of the precedent of separate but equal, was a case about a railroad car, separate but equal, segregation on a railroad car. The Pullman porters, the first African American union organization. In the early 1900s, about 14,000 African Americans worked on Pullman cars. The list goes on and on. Transportation, the Montgomery bus boycott. One that not a lot of people know about that has some local significance was in 1955. Sarah Louise Keyes was involved in a case in Roanoke Rapids with the North Carolina coach company, in which she refused to give up her seat to a white person and moved to the back of the bus. Not a lot of people hear about that because that case was determined in her favor in 1955 by the the Interstate Commerce Commission, and then about a week later, the case with Rosa Parks was confirmed in Alabama. So she didn't get a lot of kind of the press that Rosa Parks did. Even in popular culture, the movie, the Green Book, which you may, Driving Miss Daisy. Heck, it's even called the Underground Railroad. So transportation and civil rights and the history of African Americans are intertwined, and the Green Book fits right into that. I'll be honest with you, I had heard of the Green Book until we had the exhibit here. I had some cursory knowledge of it. I knew it was a travel guide specifically for African Americans in the mid 20th century. How many of you have heard of the Green Book? Okay. Like I said, it was one of those things I'd heard about. I wasn't really familiar with, and it's been interesting to kind of learn about it. We do have an exhibit here. It's through the Department of Cultural Resources, and specifically with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, who works with the North Carolina Historical. They work with the Department of Cultural Resources. And what I wanted to propose to you, if you got some time, maybe later after I don't talk too long, maybe we could go and I could show you some things about that. The exhibit is here until May the 26th. And so take advantage of it and take a look at it. I thought about this too when I was giving. I reckon the maddest my daddy ever got at me was when I was growing up. Each year, a family member got to pick a place to go on vacation. My brothers always wanted to go to the mountains or Myrtle Beach or something like that. I wanted to go to the Outer Banks. I seen so much cool stuff there, Jockey's Ridge, the lighthouse and all. And Daddy said, well, all right, you're 16 years old, you plan it out and we'll go. Okay, so we went, we had a grand old time. And we were gonna leave Nag's Head and go down to Ocracoke, and we're gonna ride the ferry across to Cedar Island and wind up down the next day, spend the night in Morehead City. Well, I wasn't a world traveler. I didn't even have my driver's license. So we get down to Ocracoke, and right as we're about to pull on the ferry, and it's the last ferry, and the gate comes down and they say, "We're sorry, we're all full. You should have called for reservations ahead of time." All right, so we've got to drive 2.5 hours all the way back up the Outer Banks to Manio, and then when we get there, we've got to go across the Man's Harbor and come back down. And y'all, it was 3 hours and it was 160 miles. And if you've ever driven on Highway 264 in eastern North Carolina, you can live. We went 40 miles without seeing a gas station.
Wow.
And it was complete and total silence after my dad blew up and blessed me out. And he said, "You should have known better. You should have called ahead and all the rest of this." And he goes, "This is what I get." I said, "Well, look, it's your fault, man. Why in the world would you plan your traveling out based on the expertise of a 16-year-old? So it's your fault." That didn't go over. I tried that. That didn't go over too well. And my father was nervous, and we were in the middle of nowhere, and it's dark, and we're literally hundreds of miles away from anywhere. And he was genuinely concerned. He's got a family here, okay? He's got kids. We're in the middle of nowhere. What if we break down? And we finally got to Englehart, North Carolina, and there was a light, and there was a gas station, and we got gas. And he said, "We've been riding on fumes for like the last 2 months." He said, "Don't ever do anything like this again. Be more responsible." And a few years ago, I rode down to the Outer Banks, and I went through Englehart, and the trauma of all of that came back. There's a point to this story, okay? Traveling, particularly in times past, it's not like it is now. We don't have the facilities that we have now. We don't have cell phones, things like that. And we were in the middle of nowhere. And I thought how traumatic that was. I mean, it even bothers me, half a century later. But what if you added another layer to that? And what if where you went, that gas station you found, or that we found a terrible motel in Washington, North Carolina, it was awful. But they were accommodating to us. What if people didn't want you there? What if you were discriminated against? I didn't think about, you add that to the trauma that's already there. And y'all have to think back in the day, times are not like they are now. We didn't have interstate highways. We didn't have cell phones. People traveled, and it could be a dangerous experience. And particularly in the world prior to 1964, I thought about it. There's a song called "The Way It Is," and there's a line in there. "They passed a law in '64 to give those who ain't got a little more." And I finally figured out he was talking about the Civil Rights Act. And in the days of segregation, and in that time period, there was something called the Negro Motorist Green Book, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. Basically, somebody asked me the other day, "Well, what was the Green Book?" And basically, it was an annual guidebook for African American travelers. It was originally published by a man in New York City named Victor Hugo Green, hence the name Green Book. It was published from 1936 to 1967, and it particularly appealed to the traveling African Americans. Now, let me give some context on this too. Probably one of the most significant events in world history, certainly United States history, happened in 1907. And that's when a man named Henry Ford introduced a vehicle, a car known as the Model T. Okay? Now, it was in production until 1927. We're almost 100 years down the road since the end of production of the Model T. Why is that significant? It is still the fourth largest selling automobile in history. The only automobiles that sold, they've sold 16 million of them. The only vehicles that have outsold the Model T are the Toyota Corolla, they're number one. The Volkswagen Beetle is a Russian Fiat car that the communists made, it's number 3. And number 4 is the Model T. Why is that significant? Because the car had been invented, but it was only accessible to the wealthy and the few. Everyone wanted their own car. And in terms, if you extrapolate 1927 what the car was, what you paid for the car now, would be worth about $24,000 today, which made it affordable to all families, or a large number of families, okay? Even to the point that believe it or not, and this was a stat that really astonished me, was that by 1950, approximately 475,000 African American families owned vehicles. In 1950, collectively, this is a stat that really got me. See if I can find the exact figure on it here. In 1950, there were 25 million automobiles in the United States. 8 years later, there were 67 million. After the Second World War, and with the pent-up consumerism, remember the hard times of the war, things were rationed like gasoline, Detroit didn't even really manufacture automobiles from 1941 to 1945. They were busy making tanks and army trucks. So there's this pent-up consumerism, there's this pent-up desire to own a car. You achieve status by owning a car. And particularly in the African American community, it means more in this sense. If it's your car, you can take it where you want to. You don't have to worry about riding the bus or the train or going through the indignity of segregation. Okay? So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the Green Book and the context of that time. That'll give you a little idea of what was going on. Let me ask y'all something else. This is another stat that just really got away with me. In 1900, 90% of all African Americans lived in the South. By 1940, 40% of all African Americans lived in either the north central United States or the northern United States. Following the establishment of particularly in the South, like North Carolina, South Carolina, states like that, there was a grandfather clause. Prior to that, most African American males could vote. But with the grandfather clause, you had a stipulation that you could only vote if you could prove that your grandfather had voted. Well, how many African Americans in 1900s grandfathers had voted? They were all, unless they were in rare cases free African Americans. Okay, so there's this great migration up to the north. Okay. Why are they leaving? They're leaving because there's better options. Let me ask y'all, how many of you are yourselves or have a family member that's from the South and moved up north? Okay, look at those hands right there. How many of you done it yourself? I know one over there that's done it himself. That left here, moved up there, and came back. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. Why is that significant? These folks are going to come back on weekends and holidays to visit their folks down south. Okay? So, the South, now let's be clear about something. The entire country, segregation existed in this time period, particularly bad in the South. You had cases, there was something like 600 what they call sundown towns in the southern United States, and there were actually a lot of them out west too, all the way out to California. What's a sundown town?
You've got to be off the street by
6 o'clock. Usually it's by dark, is what it is. And of course, this is endemic of a society in which there is segregation, Jim Crow laws. There's this hostility specifically to people of color. And it's not just African Americans, it's Native Americans, it's Latin Americans, people of color. Asian Americans. Oh, I love this quote. This is a quote that was in the Green Book. It says, "Carry your Green Book with you, you may need it."
Yeah,
it's toilet paper.
Yeah. Here's the thing. Oh, by the way, I want to show y'all some images that I put together here. I just want to run, and this is a theme I want to talk about tonight too. What I'm talking about, you know me, I'm always going to go with the local angle, okay? So these pictures I'm showing you, a lot of these images tonight, I really want to show you that we're not in Mississippi or Alabama. They're right here in North Carolina. I was at this very spot about 2 weeks ago. That water fountain is still there. This was taken in 1938 in the courthouse square in Halifax, North Carolina. This was taken at the bus station in 1944 in Durham. And you can see colored waiting room. This is a family from Swansboro, North Carolina that's leaving to go up to New Jersey.
that's right.
And I love this picture because He may be barefooted, but he's got a tie on.
All right.
And I was impressed with that. And then we have a nice young lady here with her hat on, and we see him again. There's another picture from that same thing. All right, I mentioned Victor Hugo Green. He was a postman. He had grown up in New York City. He married a lady named Alma Duke. She was from Richmond, Virginia. They moved to D.C. Now, he's a postman. Now, if you really want to know what's going on in a neighborhood and what's really going on, who's the person you ask?
Mailman.
The mailman. Okay,
Milkman.
the thing about Victor Hugo Green, he was a postman, but he knew a lot of places. He started out in Harlem, in the New York City and northern New Jersey area, and he knew a lot of business in places that were friendly to African Americans, where you could get a meal or whether you could be served, and you wouldn't have to worry about going through the indignity of segregation. I'll read you some quotes. George Shaw said in 1930, all Negroes who can do so purchase an automobile as soon as possible in order to be free of discomfort, discrimination, segregation, and insults. Here's another quote from the Green Book. Would a Negro like to pursue a little happiness in a theater, a beach, a pool, a hotel, a restaurant, on a train, a plane, or a ship, a golf course, summer or winter resort? Would he like to stop overnight at a tourist camp while he motors through his native land seeing America? Well, just let him try. Here's another example. On Highway Route 66, the famous Route 66, through the state of New Mexico, there were 100 hotels. There were over 100 hotels. 6 of them were owned by African Americans who were considered friendly to African Americans. And here's the other thing to think about this. Black travelers had to carry buckets, portable toilets, in the trunks of their car when they traveled because they were usually borrowed from bathrooms and rest areas and service stations and roadside stops. Travel essentials such as gasoline were difficult to purchase because of discrimination at gas stations. There's a nice quote here from Cortland Millery in 1950. He recalled that his mother spent the evening before a trip down south frying chicken and boiling eggs so that his family would have something to eat along the way and the next day. And they brought a pot with them to use the bathroom because if they couldn't find service, they had to stop on the side of the road. There were no rest stops back then. And by the way, my mom would probably today still fix a meal. Whenever we were kids and going on a trip down to Granville Paces or something like that at the beach, she would still cook. That was a way to save money. So Victor Hugo Green decides that he can do something about this. So he comes up with the idea of a travel guide specifically for African Americans. And this is also important to point this out. This is part of the subculture that was in America at that time that nobody really talked about or was aware of that. There's an entirely separate dual society going on. In the Black community, there's a whole different thing going on where there is a knowledge of places that are friendly. There's what's really going on. Who knows these things? The gas station attendant, the porter at the hotel, the mailman. Show you this has been something of controversy here recently. This is the old train station in Macon, Georgia. There's been a debate on whether or not to take this. It never occurred, I guess, to anybody in the 1920s that segregation would end. They literally wrote it in stone, which is kind of interesting to me. You're coming down south, you're tired, you need to stop, you're looking for a hotel, you see a sign like this. And by the way, this says welcome to Fayetteville. They had one in Oxford. Yeah, they had one outside of Lewisburg. The one I remember was this one when we would go down to Granddaddy Paces. I did it from Smithfield, North Carolina. And I remember this sign was actually up until 1977. And y'all correct me if I'm wrong here on something. I know that the Ku Klux Klan their membership has never been noted for their intellectual prowess. But y'all, how stupid do you have to be to misspell KKK?
Oh, come on.
I mean, that's not actually, am I missing something here? I didn't know. I know it's
Nights.
it's for what?
Nights.
Nights. I wondered if there might be a reason. I know I got interested in it because kuplos is a Greek word for circle. And it was frequently used in fraternal organizations, much like Lambda Chi or Kappa Alpha. You see a lot of fraternal organizations. And then, of course, clan came from a tribe, a group of people, and specifically so many people in the Ku Klux Klan were of Scottish-Irish heritage. And of course, the clan gets changed for the K. But anyway, I just thought.
So the 4Ks
4K.
actually had meaning, all 4Ks, or was that just a mistake?
I think it means nights. I think it means nights. But I remember when I looked at this, I thought, geez, you got to be pretty dumb to be in this organization to begin with. But then, you got literacy issues too.
And then Mark, if I see join,
Yeah, go ahead.
they didn't say black or white, so I could join. Let's move.
Well, Bab, I think it might have said you had to be a Native American. It's interesting. This is a quote that was in one of the early green books with the introduction of this travel guide in 1936. It's been our idea to give the Negro travel information that will keep him from running into difficulties, embarrassments, and make his trips more enjoyable. When you're traveling, please mention the Green Book in order that they might know how you found their place of business, as they can see that you are strangers. If they haven't heard about this guy, ask them to get in touch with us so that we might list them and list their place. It's interesting, if you look at the Green Book, a lot of places have names that are specific to Black history. This is one I particularly thought that was interesting, the Booker T. Washington.
Do you know where that is, Mark?
Yeah, it's out of Baltimore. It's outside of Baltimore. Look, Baltimore News. See the Baltimore News there? Yeah. And I thought it was really interesting that they had Star of David on here too, because Jewish people as a whole had been going through a great deal of discrimination and segregation too. So throughout, particularly in the South, there was a kind of an alliance between people of Jewish heritage and African American. And I thought it was interesting that Star of David was on there too. This is a typical entry that was in the Green Book. I think this is from 1952. I just want to point out some things here that are significant. Greensboro Magnolia Hotel, which incidentally is still in business. It's still in business. It's bed. They called it tourist homes back then. It's a bed and breakfast now. It's kind of interesting to me. What's called a tourist home when you rented a room is called a B&B now. Henderson Adams Tourist Home was on Chestnut Street. In case you wonder where that was, that's right down from Cotton Memorial Church. Any of y'all remember Raina Adams? It's his aunt and uncle that ran the place. They ran it for about 30 years. It was on Chestnut Street. Here's some other places. I love some of those. Mark's Tourist Home and Cabins. A home when you are away from home. Clean, attractive rooms and cabins. Excellent meals served to order in pleasant surroundings. A lot of Green Book places were in Durham and Raleigh. Deluxe Hotel, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Legion Home Restaurant. There were several guidebooks specifically for African Americans, but the Green Book was the one that took off and really became popular. At one point, they were selling about 15,000 to 25,000 a year. Their real heyday came in the late 50s. Now, why the Green Book? And it has something to do with the Rockefeller family. Okay? This is Laura Spelman Rockefeller. Now, she grew up she was born in 1840 in Ohio, and she was actually, in her youth, she assisted people on the Underground Railroad. Her family was noted abolitionists, and she married a man named John D. Rockefeller. Now, John D. Rockefeller, if you adjust his fortune in today's money, he's the richest person who ever lived. He's worth about $336 billion today. by point of comparison, Bill Gates worth what, about 100 million, 100 billion, something like that. And John D. Rockefeller was not of the finest character, but his wife really pushed him to do what was right, and he believed that the wealthy had a responsibility to make the world a better place. And though he was quite a cutthroat businessman, he did do that. Spelman College, good example. Spelman College, the second black college in the United States for African American women. And this kind of caring about the world and that sort of thing, she instilled that in her son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who incidentally had a son who became vice president of the United States, Nelson Rockefeller. The company that John D. Rockefeller started was Standard Oil of New Jersey. Standard Oil, S-O. And what they did, before there was Exxon, what was it? S-O. Y'all remember S-O? It literally is the phonetic spelling for Standard Oil, the abbreviation for Standard Oil. And she was dedicated as her son. Matter of fact, her son, and this is a program for another day, but I just want to mention this. There was a man from Vance County named Thomas Morgan who ran the Sperry Corporation. He became one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He died in 1967. In 1943, he and John D. Rockefeller Jr. put the money together to begin the United Negro College Fund. Like I said, it's a really interesting story because one of the founders of that organization was from Townsville, North Carolina. But like I said, that's a program for another day. And they didn't necessarily give money. They did something better than that. They contributed Standard Oil stock. Okay, and that's why that fund did so well and it's existed for so long. Now, in the 1930s, there were about 1,100 Esso gas station dealerships in the United States. Over 300 were owned and run by African Americans. And the reason why is Laura Spelman Rockefeller and her son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., really catered to the African American community. If you saw an Esso station and you were black, you knew you could use the bathroom. You knew if your car broke down, they would fix your car. And there were two gentlemen that were primarily responsible for that. This man over here on the right is known as James A. Jackson. Now, there's a lot of people who have named James A. Jackson, so he had to kind of make himself stand out. He was known as James Billboard Jackson. Not because he marketed for Esso, but because he started Billboard magazine. Remember Billboard magazine? He started that, and then he moved on. He became a PR executive hired by the Rockefellers for Esso, and then he also hired this gentleman right here. This man's name is Wendell Perry Austin. Now, you know me. I'm always looking for the genealogical angle here. And with a name like Wendell Perry Austin, would you think that he had some local connections? Yeah. Of course. He was from Charlotte, North Carolina, but his father was from Chatham County, North Carolina, and his father was from Warren County, North Carolina. Y'all know Austin, so you know that name, okay? They were the marketing executives for Esso. It's interesting. This is another picture of James Billboard Jackson, and I got to show you this. One of his good friends was a man named Ellis Marcellus. I like the ring of that, Ellis Marcellus. Yeah. He was a prominent businessman in New Orleans, and he actually started the first Esso station there. And in honor of his friend James Jackson, he named it Billboard Esso Station. And if the name Marcellus looks familiar in New Orleans, two of his grandsons were Wynton Marcellus and Brandon Marcellus. And I just thought that was interesting. Because the Green Book was distributed, it was distributed everywhere, hotels, restaurants, but every Esso station had one. So that was the network, and that's how the Green Book really took off. As I mentioned, he started in 1936. I'll show you some of the covers and things here in a minute. This is an interesting quote, I thought. There will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal rights and privileges in the United States. He never lived to see that happen. He died in 1960. His wife took over the editorship and running of Green Book. After that, by the way, mobile is also now part of SONX. I just want to point that out. This is kind of a typical picture from the Times. The Green Book ran from 36 to 1967. Before I became a librarian, I was in the advertising business. I was in the advertising field and graphic design, and I've always been interested in the history of graphic design. And aside from the significance of the Green Book from a civil rights point of view and a historical point of view, it's also interesting to look at it and see how it reflects the country and how things were developed at the time. It started out pretty basic. This is the first edition in this is actually 1938. That's 1936. I got them reversed. That's the first one, that's the 38. As you can see from a visual point of view, it's fairly simple. It was on hiatus during the Second World War. Nobody's traveling during the war. Gas is rationed, tires are rationed, things like that. But after the war, as I mentioned, it was this pent-up desire to travel. To show you some of the covers here is the Green Book in 1948. These dapper folks are heading out, y'all. Again, showing the Green Book. Carry your Green Book with you, you may need it. And you may need it not just because your car breaks down, but you might want to avoid, and there's somebody made a statement, it keeps your vacation from becoming unpleasant. And I thought, well, yeah, getting beaten up is not that's a little unpleasant. Yeah.
I notice it's interesting on the bottom there, it says, it's got a quote from Mark Twain, travel is fatal to prejudice.
It is.
And that's an interesting connection.
It's an interesting,
about traveling.
And I thought it was a great quote from Twain because he made a fact, I love the Green Book because there's all sorts of quotes and things in there like that are just kind of, it's almost like, y'all ever remember like an almanac almost, or like the Grid or something like that. I don't know if you remember the Grid. Here's one, I was thumbing through it and I saw, how to keep from growing old. I thought, well, gosh, this looks pretty interesting. And of course, here are some tips. Always pass the car ahead on curves and turns and don't use the horn. It may unnerve the fellow in front of you. Demand half the road. Always drive in the middle of the road. Let's see. Always speed. Shows them that you're a man of pep. Never stop and look at railroad crossings. It consumes time. Always lock your brakes when skidding. It makes the job more artistic. In sloppy weather, drive close to pedestrians. Dry cleaners really appreciate this. Obviously, there's some tips in here about how to drive properly. He is also big on preparedness. Proper tune-up. He always reminds you of complete ignition inspection, including lights and engine wiring, spark plugs, changing the oil, the generator, timing change, just basic common sense. Like I said, so just some good advice for being out in the world and traveling. You got to remember, traveling is changing after the Second World War. The Green Book starts to become, look, notice the name change. It's not the Negro Traveler's Motor Guide. It's now, Motor Green Book, it's now the Negro Travelers. It's not just restricted to automobiles now. Of course, air travel has come along. This is a cover on the 1956 Green Book, and Green was right on top of it because in 1956, and this was a profound event that people kind of don't think about now, the interstate highway system comes into being. And this also starts something that kind of has an effect on civil rights too. We're getting federal money now, Medicaid, Medicare, school systems in the 1960s, the Great Society. This is federal money, interstate highway. The caveat with federal money that's allocated is you can't discriminate if you're going to take this money. It's interesting, here in Granville County and Vance County, the two places that the integration really started on a large scale were not in the school system, not in private civic groups, the hospitals. Jubilee Hospital and Shaw integrated in 1963 and 64. Why so early as opposed to school system that got Medicaid and Medicare? They could not qualify for that money. They discriminated against. I read a lot about World War II, and one of the more enduring images of the Second World War, this was taken in 1945 in Germany, is the American tanks rushing forward and the German POWs heading to the back. Okay? The idea of an interstate highway system or a four-lane highway was foreign to Americans. This was a German invention, believe it or not. And so, who was the architect of that victory over the Germans? Well, the man who became president just a few years later, in 1952, Eisenhower. By the way, this is a Model T, in case you didn't know what one looked like. And one of his enduring legacies is the interstate highway system. And I thought it was really interesting because, like I said, Green was right on top of that. This lesson and made more uniform the highway system and contributed to the lessening of segregation on the highway. It's interesting. This one is what year is this? This is 62, I believe. No, there's 62 over there. I love the 62. Look at these folks having a good time. They're going sailing, they're dancing, they're riding horses. This is all part of that idea that, you are a consumer, and you get out and enjoy yourself. Green actually come in for a little bit of contention in that, and this is kind of a sign of the times, the people on the covers and in the Green Book were generic. They weren't specifically designed and pictured as being African American. As a matter of fact, this was a bit controversial because this was the first time anybody that was obviously African American had been placed on the cover. And this is also in line with what's going on in the country in the early 60s. As the civil rights movement gained steam and things moving, there's this idea that the black community is not separate, but they have their own culture, and they should embrace that culture. Quit trying to look like white people. Express the idea. We had Culture Fest the other day. You wouldn't have had anything like that in 1962, okay? The idea is to embrace your culture, to embrace your heritage, and slowly but surely the Green Book became a little bit obsolete and dated as time went on. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, a lot of the dam burst and segregation started coming to an end on an overt way. And it's kind of interesting because this is the 64 cover, and this is the last year that they had one, 66, 67. And you notice something about it? It's not even green anymore. And of course, this is just kind of somebody generic looking person having their own good time.
What's the angle on the saying it's a facsimile edition?
I don't know the significance of that. There's also something else interesting going on here. You've got hotels, camps, vacation eateries, tourist homes. One of the things that Green took, after Green died, they took off, there used to be a lot of clubs, music halls, jazz halls, and places that specifically entertainment venues for African Americans. And as he got older, I think Green started to see those as being maybe not as sophisticated, or he was a conservative guy. And it's interesting because they start moving away from that. His wife had gotten older. He had passed away. With the coming of the Civil Rights Act, there was less of an impetus to have the Green Book. Sales started to drop off, and the last year it was published was in 1967. The world had changed. And it's also a little bit symbolic in what happened in the United States at that time as segregation came to an end, because you had some traditional institutions that existed in the black community, the Green Book, historically black colleges, business districts that were specific to African Americans, and those things kind of fell by the wayside in a large measure as African Americans were integrated into society at large. You think about Mary Potter School, Henderson Institute. Any of you familiar with Palmer Institute? You might be familiar with that. There's a connection here, by the way. And so the Green Book kind of was the world up and changed. When things change, sometimes there are all sorts of unintended consequences. Who would have known that years ago when the cell phone came out that nobody under the age of 50 would buy a watch anymore? Just things like that happen. I did get interested, there were no places in Granville County listed in the Green Book. There are some local places that were listed. I'll just go through some of them real quick for you. There was Young's Hotel in Littleton. South Hill had Brown's New Cafe. Remember, that area is on, Oxford didn't have some places, but there were 3 in Henderson. I love this one. Chase City had the Green Door Restaurant, and across the street was the Red Door Restaurant, which you found out in the Green Book. Let's see, Durham had several places on Pettigrew Street. They had the Biltmore Hotel, the College Inn Restaurant, Thompson's Esso. In Henderson, there was Adams Tourist Home, Miss Besh's Tourist House. I'll show you that in a minute. This is the Deluxe Hotel on Cabrera Street in Raleigh. This is where all black entertainers stayed. When they came and played the Jordan Arena, it's just down the few blocks down from Jordan Arena. You had Tab Calloway stayed there. Bass Waller stayed there. Nat King Cole. Got to mention Nat King Cole because there's a local angle there. His wife was, his second wife, her name was Maria Hawkins. Her Hawkins family was from Henderson, North Carolina, where she was raised by her aunt, who was Charlotte Hawkins Brown, which some of you may know ran Palmer Institute. And to say that Charlotte Hawkins Brown was old school, I mean, she didn't think anything. Maria Hawkins' mother had died in childbirth, so she went to go live with her aunt, and her aunt raised her. And she became a very well-known jazz singer in her own right. She met Nat King Cole. And 7 days after he divorced his first wife, they got married in the biggest wedding that had ever happened in Harlem at the time. It was a 7-tiered cake. They were married by a man named Adam Clayton Powell, who was a prominent congressman and politician from New York. So she had this local connection. The Hawkins family also were involved in Henderson, North Carolina, the Marable House that we were talking about earlier on Andrews Avenue, which if any of you, I should have concluded a picture of, it's a very California and stylish house, and she got that design from Nat King Cole. Mention that. This is Magnolia Inn, the bed and breakfast that's still standing in Greensboro. There were about 5,500 places over the years that were listed in the Green Book. 337 were in North Carolina. About 60 of those places are still standing. Which about 20% of them are still standing, which all things considered, the time changes that have happened, I'm amazed that many are still standing. There are actually 4 that are still in business. Friendly Barbershop in Durham, Magnolia Inn in Greensboro, and there's 2 others in the Charlotte vicinity. This is Hall's Beauty Shop in Raleigh. That was in the Green Book. It's still there. It's a barbershop now. Incidentally, in 1940, there were about 30,000 beauty shops that were in the United States that were owned by African Americans. And almost a third of those were actually owned by women, which I thought was really interesting in that time period. Some other places, probably the most famous building still standing that was in the Green Book is the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. And that's where Dr. King was killed on April 4th, 1968. New York Restaurant in Raleigh, still standing. It's a different name now. It's actually a barbershop now, believe it or not. There are 2 buildings locally that are still standing that were in the Green Book. One is on Eaton Street in Henderson, North Carolina, which is over near Pinkston Street. It's this house right here. It was Chavis and Green's taxi cab service. Clarence Green ran a taxi cab service out of his home here in the late 1940s to early 1960s. And also on Rock Spring Street, this is Miss Betch's tourist home. This house doesn't look that big, but it actually has 7 bedrooms in it. I'm actually considering urban renewal. The fact we're half a century down the road, I'm surprised as many of these places are still standing they do. If you're interested in learning more about the Green Book, there's an excellent site. Type in Negro Motorist Green Book Smithsonian Institute. They have a wonderful virtual tour on that. And there's also the North Carolina African American Heritage Committee has a Green Book project where you can go on this site. You can actually find where all the Green Book places were located. And that's kind of in general a little about the Green Book. I guess it's driven off into history now, but we need to remember it. It's a different time and a different world. And I'm always amazed. I've been studying history for like 40 years now. And I'm always amazed at what I don't know and what you discovered that you don't know. There's a lot of things out there, and the Green Book was one of those things. That's why I was really interested in it and did a lot of research on it. Do any of y'all have any questions with regard to the Green Book?
Just a comment.
Sure.
I can remember, I was born in Baltimore, but my parents were from North Carolina. And I can remember when we would come visit, or when we would leave, our grandmother would make up a shoebox of food. And I never really fully appreciated until later in life what one of the motivating reasons for that may have been. That as a kid, all I could do was just wait to get in the box.
Right.
But
And you think that's how some won't get hungry. But
Right, yeah,
there's
but
more to
it's-
it than that.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Mark, I think there was a movie made about the Green Book.
Let's talk about the Green Book. There was a movie, but only in name only. When I was doing this, I got interested in watching the Green Book.
About the guy.
Yeah, which I think is an interesting movie. But it's green. They discuss the Green Book at the very beginning, but that's not really what the movie is about.
I have used the Green Book.
Yeah, look, if y'all got a Green Book, let me tell y'all something. I got curious to see how much a Green Book is worth. It's about $60 or $75 on A-books or something. Oh, that's pretty expensive. That's the facsimile. That's the recreated, reprinted edition. If you've got an original, I've seen them sell between $4,600 and $5,200. And you still got yours.
I have no idea where it is.
So you do remember using the Green Book?
I did. I was telling one nigga about the trip. And I'm sorry, I didn't put the connection between, that's because I'm so old. I didn't put the connection between this Green Book and the other one until I got to thinking about it, I think I was driving a trip, from Oxford. It must have been from Oxford to Texas somewhere. It was. And my daughter was a baby, not a baby, but a kid at that time. And my girlfriend, I think I must have been teaching in Jersey at the time or something. And my girlfriend was visiting with me, and we were driving to Texas. Where did I say? El Paso, Texas. Because my sister lived in El Paso, okay? And we get to the Green Book to give us the hotels where we would stop every night, okay? Because we had a very touchy experience in one town. I can't remember that. I'm sorry I didn't think about this ahead of time so I could call my daughter and get more detail. But we stopped at this particular place because we stopped every night, okay, and drove in the daytime. And so at this particular place, we walked, it was like a boarding house, okay. When we walked in, it was the living room with a pot-bellied stove, and we looked at each other then, with men sitting around it.
Look out.
And here we are, women with a young child, okay? And so I looked at Barbara and I said, I don't know what we're gonna do now. This is nice, we don't want to drive it. So we looked at the room, but when we went up to the room had a bed, and the bed had a mattress on it that was, I don't know whether you've seen these old-fashioned blue and white striped mattress. This was a bed with a mattress on it. I mean, that was it. I mean, no sheets. It didn't have sheets. It was just a bed. So I looked at my girlfriend. I said, we can't stay here. We can't stay. So I called the next place, which was in New Orleans. Our next stop was New Orleans, right? And I called the place in New Orleans and told the gentleman our problems, And this is at night then. And so we took a chance and we drove at night. Now, when we got to New Orleans, this was like a nice hotel on the river. Okay, we were so glad we did. But yeah, that was one of my experiences with the Green Book.
Well, look, let me ask you, does anybody else ever remember using the Green Book? 'Cause, I mean, it's been a while.
Yeah, that's been a while.
How about you, Sally?
Well, we never used the Green Book, but I wanted to mention that our father left here after 1930 and ended up in New Jersey, in Orange, New Jersey, and there's some sites on the Green Book in Orange, New Jersey. And I can relate to this business of cooking chicken or whatever in a pot and taking it on the trip, because when we would go to summer camp, that's what my mother did. And my mother, was from New Jersing. But
She could cook,
her
too.
husband was from North Carolina, so he was going to be, making that chicken and bringing it on the trip with us. So I remember that. Oh, one last thing I would like to say. I'm sorry. I think some of the comments in the book were kind of like, they didn't have iPads and cell phones, so this was an entertainment. But the kids were saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?"
Yeah, it's almost like I said, it was almost like an almanac in some ways.
Yeah.
They would offer helpful hints and things and quotes and things.
There was a
like
bit of entertainment there for you along the way on the trip.
that. Somebody over here had a question on it.
When blacks would travel on airlines in the South or across the country, do they have to sit in the back also?
I got curious about that myself, and I could never find an answer for it because I didn't know it was such an expensive and such a unique way to travel up until, even to the 70s. Somebody said now, but travel on a plane is what travel on a bus was 50 years ago. I don't, it's a different kind of thing. That's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for it, but I wondered about that. I'm gonna find it. Before you come back to the library, I'll get you an answer on that. All right. Sure.
Question for you. During this period of time, where's the Green Book being published from?
It was published by a company out of New York called Gibraltar Publishing. And it was very, very expensive to publish. Let me just say this, the Greens never became wealthy off of this. He kept his day job until 1952. He was a postman until he kept it until he got retirement age. It was very expensive to make and manufacture. They didn't make, well, the first edition sold for 25 cents, which was outrageously expensive in 1936. And the last year, I think it sold for $1.
What was the number of editions? The number printed?
Usually they
Per
sold
year.
about 15,000 to 20,000 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you've got to put it relative to the population of the time. It's a little bit like the Model T being the fourth biggest selling car of all time. Well, 9 out of every 10 cars were Model Ts. Think of how few people were driving back then.
One of the things of my mentor, Dr. Helen Chim, is also known as Queen Mother Moreno Ajasara II. One of the things she shared a lot of this with me, but one thing I'll share with you very quickly, which you might already know, is that the culture fest which she envisioned was to use this to bring all people in Granville County together.
Well, I think that happened the other day. If y'all don't have any more questions or comments or anything, if y'all want, if some of you will go take a look at our exhibits, if you want
Nice
to.
presentation, Mark.
Okay, everybody measure good. If you would like to learn more about this and other subjects relative to local history in North Carolina and the history of the United States, please come visit us in North Carolina. And just remember, the exhibit will be here through May the 26th.
That was very good.
I
Culture fest. Good. Nice assistant. We're gonna have a costume ball. Yeah, John, he's here, Mr. Stark.
Yeah, we came downtown, we were to park on the street, yeah.
My pleasure too. Well, I like your shirt, man.
Thank you.
I'm not gonna take it.
I ain't got one.
Nice meeting you.
No,
No.
we connected now.
Yeah.
We were connected before we got here.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah. So we go hang in here.
Hang on. Change tape.
Well, very well.
Tape.
I tell you, you got 23 books.
Tables were never enslaved, never enslaved.
Is that right?
Always for free people.
Always disciplined.
Wow, you may be telling me something I didn't know.
Tables were never enslaved, it's always free people. You from here?
Well, my parents are from North Carolina. I was born
I'm gonna go look at
They
this.
were playing in Halifax,
Excuse me, folks.
back in the day, so it's,
Yeah, the tables was always free people. They was never enslaved. And now some tables.
That's a revelation. Well, how you doing, my brother?
How you doing, sir?
I'm doing good, James Taylor.
Guillermo Nurse.
I'm sorry?
Guillermo Nurse.
Guillermo.
Yeah.
My pleasure. I get it.
He might be our next mayor.
Yeah.
He's running for mayor.
I kind of feel that,
Yeah.
that leadership aura right now.
Yeah, that's a mere
How
smile.
did you find out about this table?
Well, we're actually involved with the plumber chief of some
Yeah.
only managing that
Oh,
now.
I met you.
Right, at the county meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew that before when I heard you
Yeah,
before.
when you said that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Taborn from Oxford, the Taborn, the Andersons, and all that, they was never
We
enslaved.
come in to close down
Thank
and
you, my
stuff.
brother.
They was never, Taborns were never enslaved.
Well, I don't know, that may be different
Yeah.
segments of things.
Recording stopped.
You're right, I need to do a little more research.